Everyone loves a good underdog story. I do. I'm sure you do as well. In the spirit of that, I wanted to put together 5 videos on 5 good underdog stories. This is not a 5 best, a top 5 greatest. It's just 5 stories that I happen to like, and I think you will as well. Hopefully at least one of these maybe you haven't heard about yet. The only criteria is that I didn't want to cover any of the stories that have been exhaustively covered over the years. While Alan Kulwicki's 1992 championship and Derek Cope's 1990 Daytona 500 are both great underdog stories, they've been covered at great length. If you're not familiar with either one of those stories, type in the search bar, check them out. So we got to start somewhere. The one we're going to start off with is one of my personal favorite, not only one of my favorite underdog stories, but actually one of my very favorite NASCAR storylines of the past 30 years. And that is the 2011 Daytona 500 won by Trevor Bayne. Starting right now. Okay, so if you're a longtime NASCAR fan, allow me to take you back. And if you're new, allow me to paint a scene for you. The 2011 Daytona 500 was won by Trevor Bayne. Now, you probably heard the name by now. On the morning of February 20th, 2011, even the dedicated NASCAR fan could be forgiven for never having even heard of Trevor Bayne at that point. Prior to 2011, he'd run 0 Truck Series races. He'd run some ARCA events. And he had 1 season in the Xfinity Series, but that was with different teams. Michael Waltrip Racing early in the season. He did have a pole at Talladega, but no wins. He wasn't setting the world on fire, and he wasn't getting a lot of attention from fans and media. But he did get the right kind of attention from the right person. Late in 2010, when Michael Waltrip Racing and that situation and that opportunity dried up for Trevor Bayne, he was picked up by Jack Roush of Roush Racing. And the intent was for him to run the 2011 Xfinity, then Nationwide Series, for his team. Well, one of the part of that plan was they wanted to get his feet wet with Cup Series racing. They had planned on entering him into a couple of Cup races between the end of 2010 and 2012. They didn't have 1 Cup Series start in 2010. That was in the Wood Brothers number 21 Ford. He finished 17th that day in Texas. And pretty much, I feel like it went pretty well unnoticed. First time I remember hearing Trevor Bayne's name was in Speed Weeks leading up to the Daytona 500. Also, keep in mind, this guy was 20 years old. Not during Speed Weeks. He was 20 years old for the Daytona 500. His birthday was on the Saturday before. He was 19 through practice, through Speed Weeks, through the qualifying races. He turned 20 the day before the Daytona 500. So he started getting some attention in Speed Weeks because he was right out of the gate running lap times in practice just as fast as the veterans. And he got the attention then of Jeff Gordon. It's vitally important to the story. As you know, the Daytona 500 qualifying is a little bit different. You know, you have single car qualifying. The only people who are set for the field is first place and second place. Everybody then has to compete in one of the 2 Gatorade dual races, 150-mile qualifying races. That sets the inside row and the outside row for the Daytona 500. Trevor Bayne, his lap time was 3rd fastest on time trial day, so he barely missed that front row. Jeff Gordon was on the front row, so was Dale Earnhardt Jr. So in their qualifying race, Jeff Gordon's teammates, Mark Martin, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Jimmy Johnson, were all in a different qualifying race. Jeff Gordon had no teammates. This was the year of the tandem draft, where 2 cars had to stay together. Not 3, not 4, not 1 especially. 2 cars. So Jeff Gordon had no teammates to draft with. Trevor Bayne had gotten his attention during practice, and they were starting at the front of their respective qualifying race. So he goes to Trevor Bayne before the race and says, "Hey, would you like to hook up and draft with me?" Which, of course, I'm sure to him was mind blowing. You know, this is Jeff Gordon, and he's a 19-year-old kid. So they hook up, and they ran really well. They ran up front the whole time. Trevor Bayne was caught up in an accident towards the end of the qualifying race. They tore up the car pretty bad. So the Wood brothers and Donnie Wingo, who was the crew chief there at the time, they're sorting out whether or not they want to fix this car. They knew they had a fast race car, and they did not want to go to a backup. But they're trying to decide, can they get this car back to where it was, or do they need to just go on and get the backup out? And while they're trying to decide this, they ran into Doug Yates, famous engine builder for Ford, also the son of Hall of Famer Robert Yates. And they asked him what he thought, and his answer was, what would Glenn do? Speaking of Glenn Wood, the family patriarch. And that settled it. They said they're going to fix the car. It was not easy. They spent, I think, all day Thursday and Friday and probably some of Saturdays fixing the race car. They only got it done in time to go out the final practice and run a couple laps. But that was all it took. Trevor Bayne, after running a couple laps last practice, said, hey, this car is as fast as it ever was. That's all they needed to hear. They knew they made the right call. All right, so now, setting the scene for the Daytona 500. Trevor Bayne, probably haven't heard about him at all before then. Or if you have, it's very little. So, and he's 19 years old, turns 20 years old. They crashed their car. It's shaping up to be another day for Trevor Bayne where he flies under the radar like he had pretty well up until this point in his career. So he had gotten quite a bit of attention through Speed Weeks because of his practice times, because of the way he raced with Jeff Gordon. That was a big one in the qualifying races. So now we're at the time for the Daytona 500. He got enough of attention. So during the pre-race, on the pace laps, whoever is in the booth calling the race, a lot of times we'll get on the two-way radio and dial up somebody in the field to speak to him about the race. It's almost always a veteran, someone who's either been running well or has a history of running well at that particular track, or at least somebody who's maybe building momentum in their career. Darrell Waltrip that day decided to call up Trevor Bayne. That shows you there what an impression he'd been making in Speed Weeks. Then there's the start of the race. And this, because of, like I said before about the tandem draft, this was not a typical Daytona 500. I think there were early crashes that took out major contenders. Jimmy Johnson was one. Greg Biffle was taken out early. Kevin Harvick had engine trouble early. But there were still quite a few very experienced veterans and even restrictor plate veterans on track. So I don't want to give the impression that Trevor just happened to dodge, dip, dive, ducked, and dodged his way around the track and made it to the finish line first because he was the only guy left standing. That's not what happened. But it did help that there was some major players taken out early in the race. The race wears on, getting close to the end. Dale Earnhardt Jr. is still in the race. Tony Stewart is still in the race. Carl Edwards is still in the race. David Reagan, who'd been running very well, was still in the race. And there's a late caution. Green-white checker sets up. David Reagan is leading. He's on the outside lane. Trevor Bayne is on the inside lane, running second. The plan was, and their crews had communicated this, the plan was when the green flag flew, David Reagan was going to jump down in front of Trevor Bayne so Trevor Bayne could then push him on. And if that happens, if that worked out, they probably win the race. We're probably having a different conversation. Granted, we may still be having this conversation because David Reagan would have been an underdog win as well. But that's not what happened. When they get to the restart zone, before they get to the start-finish line, David Reagan goes ahead and jumps down in front of Trevor Bayne. Not legal. There's some difference of opinion on whether or not they had been enforcing that rule very consistently at the time, but the rule still was you cannot change lanes before the start-finish line and advance your position. By default, he couldn't advance his position. He's the leader, but he did change lanes. They black flagged him, brought him down pit road. That leaves Trevor Bayne in the lead with another green-white checker. But he has no friends. The Wood brothers don't have any teammates. And everybody behind him is experienced super speedway racers. And they all want that Daytona 500. This is the biggest race. This is our Super Bowl. This is the day. And they all want it. And I'm sure they all have like foam in their mouth seeing this rookie in front of them. They're like, we're going to eat him alive. I'm sure that's what they were thinking. That's what I would have been thinking. So that final green flag flies. Bobby Labonte gets hooked up with him, and they get out to a lead. But you've also got Mark Martin and Tony Stewart hooked up. Juan Montoya and Kurt Busch hooked up. You've got David Gilliland and Carl Edwards hooked up. I don't know if you've heard of those guys or not, but they're good. They're real good. And they all want that win, man. So then the white flag comes out. Again, Bobby Labonte and Trevor Bayne are still hooked up out front. Behind them is Kurt Busch, Juan Montoya, and behind them is Carl Edwards and David Gilliland. Once you get to the back straightaway, though, you can see David Gilliland and Carl Edwards are on a freight train. They're hauling the mail. They've actually got more momentum building either the other four cars. So they get to turn 3. They easily shoot by Kurt Busch and Juan Montoya, and now all they got to do is stay hooked up and get right by Trevor Bayne and Bobby Labonte, and they're home free. So they start running out of real estate. They come off of turn 4. Bobby Labonte kind of moves to the side. I think he's looking to the inside to possibly try to pass Trevor Bayne, but he has nobody helping him. Carl Edwards ends up side by side with Bobby Labonte, and that's all she wrote, folks. Trevor Bayne, rookie, 20 years old, just turned 20 years old, never been heard of, never won a race, never won a truck race, never won an Xfinity race. 2 cup starts, wins the Daytona 500. One of the coolest stories, I think, ever. And it's just because of all the other parts and pieces to it. This past season, a rookie, Austin Cindric, won the Daytona 500. Nothing against Austin Cindric. I wasn't nearly as excited about that because he was kind of an established guy. He lots of Xfinity Series success. he'd been in the pipeline for a long time. Trevor Bayne had barely been heard of. He was a kid. And to come out there, it was just so cool, And you can hear it if you watch the race. You watch the commentary after the race is over. Mike Joy and Darrell Waltrip are just, the way they're talking shows that they're excited for him. Everybody's excited for him, and it was just a cool moment in the sport. One other thing to consider: the Wood brothers at the time had not been doing well. They had scaled back to a part-time schedule just because they needed to keep the doors open and keep the team alive. 2008, they didn't make the Daytona 500. They failed to qualify. They were a long way from their early days and their successes. They were a long way from the successes they've had in the past few years. Not only was this a great story for Trevor Bayne, it was also a great story for the Wood brothers. They showed the world, hey, they can still get it done. They can still build fast race cars and go out there and get it done, even with this rookie. So to kind of wrap it up and conclude, Trevor Bayne's career never really hit that watermark, that high mark that he had accomplished there in 2011. However, for one, I feel like it's a little unfair. The Wood brothers weren't, like I said before, weren't running good. Then he got signed with Jack Roush, which was a team that had been doing well, and it was on the decline. When a team's on the decline, and you have a new driver or a driver that's unproven, such as Trevor Bayne, there's the conversation start: is it the driver? Is it the driver? Is it the car? I think in this case, it probably was the car. In Trevor's last season with Roush Racing, then Roush Fenway Racing, he split the seat with Matt Kenseth, and Matt Kenseth is proven. He's got championships. He's got tons of wins, lots of success, and his results were almost exactly the same, and his feedback to the team was almost exactly the same as Trevor's had been. The next season, Ryan Newman took over. Also, large body of success. Similar result, similar feedback. I believe it was the car. It doesn't matter. Years of inconsistent results kind of stunted Trevor Bayne's career. However, that doesn't take away what he accomplished in 2011. This young man won the Daytona 500. It is our Super Bowl. It is the biggest event in stock car racing. And forever on that Harley J. Earl Trophy and in Daytona, USA, it will always have his name as a winner of the Daytona 500. In this sport, that counts for a lot. So to preview the next one, the next underdog story I'm going to do in the next video is going to be about a man who, when you first hear his name, you may not think underdog. Probably not. He's now a Cup winning and a Cup championship contending car owner. He's really rewritten the book on what a car owner is this last season. But Justin Marks was once a race car driver. And in 2016, he got a win in the Xfinity Series at Mid-Ohio in the rain. It was a great race. It was fun to watch. It's still fun to watch. And given his past up until that point, is a great underdog story. So that's what we're going to do next time. Until then, everyone have a happy new year. I'm actually filming this just a couple hours before the ball drops. This is in the very waning hours of 2022. So I hope you guys had a good year and have a great new year, and I'll see you next time.